Well, welcome to the annual John Gaw Meem lecture and discussion. Today I'm Renia Ehrenfloyd. I'm the chair of the Community and Regional Planning Department. And for those of you who are visitors, welcome to the School of Architecture and Planning and to George Pearl Hall. As we get started, I wanted to say a few things about this evening's lecture and discussion. We wanted to focus on the politics of memory and the politics of presence when we're thinking about urban change. We've had a lot of talk about that over the last years, most visibly around removing Confederate monuments. And certainly in New Mexico, the Confederate monuments came down with almost no discussion, no controversy. But when we look around New Mexico, that hasn't been true for the Oñate statues. You know that many of us have paid attention to the controversy over the Santa Fe Fiesta. And certainly on campus, the murals in Zimmerman Library have been kind of subject to activism year in, year out. And so we really see this as a continuation of a discussion about, what are the societies that we want to build? And how do we tell and retell stories as we make space, make political claims, and exercise power as we always do when we're building spaces. And so this is fundamental, the kind of working for social justice, working for the societies that we want to live in is fundamental to what we do in community and regional planning and the School of Architecture and Planning. We're very happy today to be able to welcome our guest, Dr. Lisa Bates, who will be introduced in just a moment. I have known Dr. Bates for over a decade. 10 years ago, we were both working in New Orleans, and that was after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Some of you may remember that after those hurricanes hit, 80% of the city flooded. People lost their homes, their businesses, couldn't come back, and that city was a majority African-American city, and there was real questions, and there continue to be real questions on who is the city being rebuilt for, and what it's gonna look like. And so today we get to move forward, and Dr. Bates will be talking about her current work in Portland. But this never-ending question about who are we building our cities for? How are we building them? In our smaller communities as well. Dr. Laura Harjo is going to give a full introduction to Dr. Bates. But I want to tell you just a little bit about how things will unfold. Is that we see this as a discussion. It's a dialogue. And I want to briefly introduce two people who are going to respond to Dr. Bates' talk and start the discussion about that. They are two of the many UNM scholars who are working on these critical topics. And then after that, we'll move to an open discussion, and you're certainly welcome to ask questions of any of the three, but also certainly invite you to ask a broader question that all three can respond to and talk about some of the main themes. One respondent is Moises Gonzalez, who is sitting up here. He is an associate professor in community and regional planning. He has written extensively about New Mexican cultural landscapes. And also as a UNM alum, as a student, he was active in a kind of previous era of really working to have the Zimmerman murals removed. He continues to be an active practitioner and works on urban design and planning projects throughout the state, and is also, if that's not enough, the director of the Resource Center for Raza Planning here in the school. Dr. Laura Harjo will also be a respondent. She is an assistant professor in community and regional planning, and she is also another scholar who bases her scholarship in action. She does work on indigenous spatialities and futurities, really interrogating settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy, and practices of decolonization. And then she's specifically looking through indigenous women's anti-violence activism and creative work. And her forthcoming book, Spiral to the Stars, Muskoke Tools of Futurity, will be published this coming spring by the University of Arizona Press. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Harjo to introduce Lisa Bates.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. So Dr. Lisa K. Bates is an associate professor at the Toulon, is that how you say it? School of Urban Studies and Planning at Portland State University. She does research related to housing policy and planning. Her work is particularly focused on social justice issues, including understanding how inequitable outcomes may arise from institutionalized racism in policy, design, and implementation. Her research also describes how people of color and low-income households make decisions about housing and neighborhoods, given their perceived choices and constraints. As a planner, Dr. Bates engages with space and place as important to the context of decision-making and policy-making and has conducted research in diverse settings, including Chicago, post-Katrina New Orleans, and Portland. And so, if you go and you look at her bios, like one aspect that is, really stands out about her work is that, like, as planners, as sort of workers in the design profession as well, and people building communities, can we do better? So you can see that her work is really framed around, can we do this better? She's also active in the People of Color interest group with the American Collegiate Schools of Planning. So join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa K. Bates.
It's great to be here. So you can all hear me okay? Okay, great. And I'm so glad that you mentioned New Orleans, because certainly the time that I spent in New Orleans and thinking about a memory and place attachment of what it means to be displaced from home has been really powerful and meaningful for my work since then, and the work that I'm going to talk about today. Of course, that work happens in a very, very different context in Portland, Oregon. And the work that I'm going to talk about today involves my thinking and also some practice-based work and art collaboration. And I want to especially acknowledge two of my colleagues that I've worked very closely with, Sharita Town, who's a professor at the Pacific Northwest College of Art and a socially engaged artist, and Joy Elise Davis, who is a planner, a planning professional with Design and Culture Lab, and is now the director of the Portland African American Leadership Forum, which is a Black organizing group in Portland. And they've been huge collaborators in this work, and I'll show you some of the work we've done together. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the framework of our work and thinking about the context of Portland specifically. I don't know how familiar anyone here is with Portland, but I'll tell you a little bit about the Black community in Portland. Talk about the ways that we're sort of trying to work and think about how can we restructure our understandings of the past through memory work and through memorialization. And then I'll talk about the People's Plan work that I collaborated with these two women on as a way to try to bring a Black spatial imaginary to life. So how do we bring the past into not only the present, but use that understanding for the future, and then conclude by saying a few things about what I think planning practice might take away from this work. So our work very much is guided by the work of Clyde Wood. Speaking of New Orleans, he's written he wrote a couple of books about New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, thinking about the specificity of issues of race and racism in planning, but in particular in grappling with this idea of Black life as social death, as social and political and institutionally unrecognized life as Black people because of the history and the legal structures of our country. And he asks us to think about the tools that we use as planners, the ways that we define communities through statistics, through numbers, through geographic boundaries in a GIS map, that these often highlight deficiencies, disparities, and really despair. That these are the tools of a coroner writing a death certificate. And he says, but look, the scalpel in the hands of the surgeon has a different function. It's the same tool, but it has a different function. So in this work that I've been doing in Black Portland, persistent in my mind is the question of how can I take these tools that I have as a planner, as a social scientist, and use them as a surgeon and not as a coroner? Or as Clyde Woods asked, is the patient really dead? This is a picture here on the right of the construction of Interstate 5 through the heart of the Black community in Portland back in the 1950s. Like pretty much every city in the United States, Portland, Oregon has a very intense history of urban renewal practice through the mid-century era, right? So the 50s and 60s. Unlike a lot of other big cities in the United States, however, Portland's Black community really didn't exist until World War II. There were virtually no African Americans in the state of Oregon before World War II, because when Oregon became a state in 1859, it entered the Union as a free state, but its state constitution barred Black people from living in its borders. So there was a total exclusion from the state upon pain of the lash. So any Black people who were living in the state at that time basically left and went to Washington or California. During World War II, there was a cry out from the Kaiser shipyards for war workers, and tens of thousands of Blacks came from the South to work in the war shipyards. After World War II, there was a concerted effort by city fathers to get those families and workers and community really to leave the city through very deliberate attempts to get, for example, the national president of the Urban League at that time, Bill Berry, to come to Portland and convince Black people to move somewhere else. But for those who stayed, about 10 or 15,000 folks who stayed, they lived in Northeast Portland in what we call the Albina District. The Albina District housed about 95% of Black people in Oregon at the time. And through a series of urban renewal actions, that district was demolished and moved over the course of a couple of decades for highway, for convention center, for sports stadiums. So again, very much like many other cities in the United States that we hear about in our planning history, but with such a small population of Black folks, it is families who may have been displaced 3, 4, 5 times within a couple of generations. So that experience is very deep among Black folks in Portland today. Today's displacement and really dispossession comes from gentrification. These are some maps that I did with the city of Portland showing areas of very rapid and significant gentrification. And it's this sort of like hot pink area here, which is Northeast Portland, predominantly Black neighborhoods at one time that are now have flipped from being 80% Black to about 20% Black. And what was redlining very recently up until the 1990s became a very rapid influx of capital through the creation of a new urban renewal district by the city. And that's now some of the hottest neighborhoods in the city with very high housing price, rapidly increasing housing prices, and the departure of about a third of the city's Black population has moved out from that area over the last 10 years. So when we think about the title of this talk today, How It Slips Away, We Still Here, emerges from focus group work that I've done in the Black community with folks talking about this experience, that they said, we don't know how it slipped away, wanting to reconstruct what happened, how did we lose this, at the same time of defiance of the erasure of Black people from this space, and we still here. We still here is a refrain that I hear continually among Black community members in Portland, that they don't want to be seen as people who used to live in Northeast Portland, but that we still here. So in looking at, so how can we both understand what has happened in the past, look directly at those traumas, and also use that to move into a future-oriented planning for what Black Portland can be, given this level of displacement. I've turned to this work by Karen Till and the idea of wounded cities. She speaks about, and again, this is very interesting because it's a metaphor of the body, right? So Clyde Woods is talking about the coroner and the autopsy. Karen Till is talking about wounds in the city and whether we can look at and address those wounds and understand that cities are not only property. So not only this sort of white imposed spatial imaginary that land is property and something to be bought and sold and maximize its value, but it's a living space for people and humans and communities. And if we can understand that those people and their places have been wounded by state practices, then we can begin to talk about healing in a different way. And that looking at our past histories, how did this happen? We can start to think about how we might avoid those injuries in the future, right? Wounds can heal. they're not erased. It doesn't make the past go away. It's not about papering them over. There may still be a scar, but how can we sort of do that stitching together to try to remember places? So some of our work with the community, so again, this is sort of an inquiry and a research inquiry, but also using art expression and art ways of engaging with people so that regular folks can sort of engage in a different way from how they might engage in a planning process, right? So Sharita, along with myself and some other collaborators, created as part of an exhibit called Our City in Stereo, which included, say, interviewing people about their histories, but building a timeline, an interactive timeline in the gallery. It begins from work placed by the artist Dine Yazzie about the land grab, this colonial settler land grab, and the, sort of the Oregon Trail pioneers coming, using maps and recollections of that time, saying nobody takes up space like your ancestors, and you can sort of sit there in that sitting room and sit with that. But then it moves through history, allowing people to place up their own memories. So down in the right-hand corner, a memory is about being displaced from Northeast Portland and enabling people to add stories into the timeline. This becomes particularly important when we get to the 1990s and 2000s, where there's very little history being written about that time, right? We can get a history of Portland in the 1950s, but we don't really have this very recent history, except through media accounts which would depict Northeast Portland as gang-ridden, as blighted, as in need of this urban renewal district, the sort of there's no downside to gentrification narrative that's been very dominant in Portland. So for people to be able to sort of sit down, type up their own card or write their own card and place that begins to let them see how their history can be represented and also juxtaposed with the kinds of state actions that were happening at the time, which of course everyone was not aware of, right? Everyone was not aware of the ways that mortgage capital, for example, were being directed into the neighborhood through efforts made by the city. So we're able to sort of start to think about how can we build a history and piece together the past very differently. Using this is an exhibit from last summer, which again, trying to bring documents out of the city archive, which are here on this desk. These are documents that are about urban renewal practices of the past, but particularly bring out of the archive not only the way that dominant culture and the state depicted these neighborhoods and communities, but that document the resistance of people living in neighborhoods. So to see the kinds of actually very sophisticated planning arguments that were brought forward by the community about how urban renewal and blight removal were going to continue to affect the community. So where our sort of everyday narrative of what was happening in Northeast Portland during this period of so-called blight and abandonment was sort of about people not taking care of their properties, or maybe in the most benign version of it is that people couldn't take care of their properties because they were absentee landlords, and that's sort of too bad for them. But these documents really showed that folks who were living there had a very prescient analysis about the way that blight removal, the demolition of blighted areas in the community, was making it impossible for people to access mortgage capital, to maintain their homes once they had purchased them, because of the uncertainty that was created around their properties potentially being demolished in the next wave. And so they were very clear in saying what we now as planning scholars would look back and say, that all you do when you do demolitions is sort of push people to the next neighborhood and sort of pre-justify demolishing the next area or having another urban renewal project. They were very prescient in being able to say that and have a quite sophisticated analysis around how that was going to work through mortgage capital. So we wanted to lift that up, but also to juxtapose that with some imagery that tries to bring forward very clearly what is lost in those processes. So for example, here in this print which Sharina made entitled Jump Town includes photographs from the area that was demolished for the Memorial Coliseum. That's a sports stadium area in the Rose Quarter. listing every address that was torn down so that we can be very clear that these were individual homes, individual businesses, individual families that lived there. And again, just this sort of continual refrain that Black people were here, are here, and will be here. That becomes very powerful for people as they're engaging with the gallery. We've been really trying to look at history and present history in ways that focuses on the political, right? It is actually very, I was gonna say hot right now, but that sort of trivializes it. But thinking about Black history is a thing right now in Portland. We have a racial equity framework for our city government, and there's been a lot of community activism that says we ought to look at Black history in Portland. But much of that work has been done, that's probably easier to see. Much of that work has been done in a way that is incredibly deep politicized. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So one very live project right now is the fate of a block of property in the middle of the city in probably the most gentrified commercial corridor in the city. This property was demolished through eminent domain seizure. So this entire city block. This picture is the picture that typically accompanies stories and presentations made by the city's redevelopment authority about this block. It's called the Hill Block, and this corner was a pharmacy. This was sort of the heart of the Black business community, and it was taken by eminent domain in order to expand a hospital complex nearby. The hospital complex ended up not being expanded. And in fact, as we looked back through the archives, we realized that in their original plan was not really so much to develop on this lot as to use that as a parking lot to buffer the hospital from what they consider to be an unsavory encroachment of the neighborhood. In other words, suburban folks will not come into this hospital to go to a doctor's appointment because there's Black people very close by. So if you build a moat of parking lots around the hospital complex, you can make it more safe. So it's very unclear whether there was ever really an intention to build on this lot. But currently the city is in a negotiation with the hospital to retake this property from the hospital, saying because you've never developed on it, our redevelopment authority, our development commission has the power to take it back in using the deed. So this is very live. People in the Black community want to ensure that the reuse of this property and the redevelopment is done in a reparative way, essentially, right? How are you going to do this? Are you going to give this to Black community development organization? Are you going to allow Black people to have access to this space? What's going to happen? But this is the photograph that has accompanied most of the presentations and media coverage of this story. This is actually what the building looked like at the time of its demolition, right? It was in the 1970s that this building was demolished, not the 1930s, right? It was well into the advent of color photography, but this picture lets us see this as so far past, right? And so the narrative that is being brought forward by the mayor and the head of the development commission is the past is in the past. We don't need to relitigate that. There's no reason to talk about how this happened. We should only talk about what there is going forward. So some of our work with Portland African American Leadership Forum has been simply to keep showing these pictures, to point out that this is not many generations ago. This is within my living lifetime that this happened. This is within many people's living lifetime. This is not something that is so far past that we cannot talk about how you got here. The logic that you use that said that it was necessary to remove this center of activity for Black people and push them away from this space, and to think about what actions are needed to be restorative there. So you can see there on the right, that is a totally vacant lot that goes back the full length of the block. And it's also, the other sort of troubling detail that folks get quite upset about is that this cupola now sits on a gazebo in a nearby park. That was intended to be a sort of monument to the Black community, or the articulation of it was that this is like a wonderful historic marker. But for many people who were there when this building stood, was a drugstore, was a place that people, got a soda and hung out, they view it almost like a trophy. It's like a hunter taking the head of an animal, sticking it up on their wall. That's how that's interpreted in the community. When we go in the community and ask them about what physical presence do they see of themselves in the neighborhoods. So very problematic memorialization. And this kind of problematic memorialization that is post-racial, right, in that it refuses to acknowledge the political activity and the violence of anti-Blackness of the past, makes it very difficult to see the ongoing political violence of today. If we can't even talk about how this happened, how could we think about how it still is happening, right? So one of our works has been to create these sort of DIY newspaper publications where we have been lifting up with advocacy groups like Community Alliance of Tenants and Portland African American Leadership Forum, a new framework for thinking about these blocks, but also to continually refer back to the past, the history, and how we got here. So this is what the planners were saying at the time. This is the number of buildings that were taken down. These are the people that were moved out, right? And so, how can we continue to surface and make more legible, right, what is happening in today's practices by the Portland Development Commission, where they are sort of stonewalling questions, et cetera, and how those are parallel to previous practices. We also are trying to look at some other memorial and monument, and again, just to sort of highlight the ways that a post-political version of memorialization in space can undermine our aims toward emancipation. So we have this sort of very typical depoliticized king on the left as a major marker. It's a Martin Luther King Jr. quote that they've placed out into the street, probably one of the most misused and overused and least political of King's thinking. It's actually like a traffic calming device. So it's a little bit strange. And we've held some public events on the other side of this barrier to try to activate and liven this space, this so-called plaza. And then on the right, this actually very wonderful mural by a local artist, R.B. Smith, and it's a beautiful piece and a wonderful mural that talks about political histories of Indigenous and Black struggles in Portland. But it has been placed onto the side of a large sort of high-end grocery store that is on a site that was redeveloped under massive resistance by the Black community just about 5 years ago. So with huge amounts of city subsidy, this development was created in the heart of MLK Boulevard. And the resistance was, why you're just bringing more things that gentrify us. We want to have community benefits agreements. We want you to let Black people own this land. You expropriated this from Black people in the first place. We need to have a say in what's happening. That was sort of for naught. And one of the repeated sort of phrases that people said, you want our faces, but you don't want our bodies here. You want depictions of us, but you don't want us to be here. And here, indeed, is the use of these murals, recreated murals. Again, beautiful piece, but put into a context that sort of like tries to diffuse our politics around the space. So Sharita and I also worked together to place some temporary alternative memorials and monuments in the city as part of our work, again, to try to work on planning in this gentrification context. So this is a shadow memorial. The big rock that you see there is on the site of the Coliseum. So it is on a site that was cleared by urban renewal, and it has a memorial plaque that looks exactly like this on the other side, which is commemorating some kind of steamboat company owning family in the founding of Portland. And I'm saying that not just to be dismissive, but because they're like so inconsequential to the history of Portland that like no one even knows that this thing is there. So we said, well, what if we create a monument and a memorial using the same visual language? What if we create a monument to the actual people whose homes were lost and whose businesses were lost? And what would that look like? And what would that feel like for people to see that in the shadow, but also illuminated, to bring forward a non-post-racial memorial aesthetic? What does it look like if we do what Alfred Frankowski talks about as a collective mourning as a political act? A mourning where we recognize loss and the continued loss and think about how we might work collectively to not get over that loss, but to activate differently around that loss. We also used, because we're not only talking about the past, we're talking about the present, videos of oral histories of folks who still live in Northeast Portland, part of the We Still Here, folks speaking about their history. And Ms. Geraldine spoke very eloquently about living across the street from an urban renewal eminent domain site, and with her parents and her father, saying, let him come and try to take this house. Let him come and try. Their house was spared, but many of their other family members were not. But she still lives in Northeast Portland, and many of her family members live in Northeast Portland. And so we placed and projected her voice into this space as well, to ask about how can we think about this as not only a monument to the past, but a living claim on space. And then trying to take this ethic into a planning practice. So we can do art, we can have inquiry, we can have research into history, but how do we bring this into a planning context? How do we turn now into a future orientation? Now that we've grounded ourselves differently in a past that we've collected, we've co-created collectively in a different way, we've restructured our understanding and our foundation of the past, we began to work with Portland African American Leadership Forum, or I began to work with Joy to create the People's Plan as a project that would be fundamentally about asking Black people, using Black spatial imaginary, so eliminating the logics and the tools of the coroner, how can we move forward and think about our space and place in a different way? How can we even claim space, even if it's not in historic Northeast Portland, but it's wherever we live as Black people today? And we found that very powerful things emerged and shook loose from people when we began with questions, which we often do not do as planners. We begin with premises and statements and ask people to react to them, but we do not actually operate very much around a generative question asking in which people can ask questions, right? We may ask them specific questions. Do you prioritize X or do you prioritize Y? But to have a process that started from people in the community generating their own questions, which were fundamentally motivated by the inquiry of what would it be like if this community, if this neighborhood, if this city loved Black people? What would that be for you? One of our young respondents, a teen, we had some work we did specifically with youth, with teenagers. Very powerful response. If Portland loved Black people, it would be the best city it pretends to be. There's a very powerful disconnect through all of these processes and research between the image of Portland as a wonderfully planned, livable, and sustainable city and the experience of the Black community. That even placing a few murals or having a few more sort of historic tours that say, we did wrong in the past is not reconnecting that for folks. That wound is there, and by not directly looking at it, we're not doing anything to try to heal that. So we want to try to think about how can we heal that. We did a lot of work again around conversations composed of questions. So these are some questions that emerged. So literally everyone just sits and asks questions to each other. There's no statements in the conversation. Why don't we take ownership of gentrified spaces? How can we reappropriate spaces? How much anger do we have to swallow to think we deserve these spaces? How much permission do we need to have to create these spaces for ourselves? And you can see these are very different questions from what is at the typical, planning workshop where there's a PowerPoint slide set and folks can answer in a clicker about, yes, I like this bike infrastructure, or no, I don't. These are questions that really reframe the very notions of what we're doing as planners or what the objects of our planning ought to be. And that again hint at a much deeper issue of the kind of root shock that people are experiencing because of the displacement that they've had and because of the dispossession that they've experienced. We also, tried to do some more direct and specific advocacy around a postcard campaign, Dear Next Mayor, where folks wrote in to the future mayor of Portland about what they wanted to see happen. Black Portland's future needs you to do what, and sort of try to collect these, and then ultimately built the plan, which is, again, it's premised on a right to the city that, rather than an analysis of deficiency, right, and sort of a blasé attitude about gentrification, but a plan that takes very deeply seriously the need to surface our collective history, our memories, good and bad, and to take sort of a serious look at how we might repurpose our planning tools and practices and methods toward a more emancipatory vision for Black folks in Portland. So to think about a little bit in conclusion about how we do operate as planners, right? So again, everyone is not going to create and build a multi-year art project with communities, although I would recommend it. It's been incredibly enlightening in terms of connecting up some of this theoretical work about trauma, memory, and history with a planning praxis. But that, for sort of a more mainstream planning approach, one question would be, how can we sharpen the tools of inquiry? So we have a background report, we have existing conditions, we do all that work, but how do we frame and understand those statistics and histories in ways that are not solely around deficiency, but that call into question the structures that operate around those disparities and create those disparities? So rather than simply saying, look at the terrible employment rates, look at the poor graduation, look at the, how people don't do the composting program correctly, but ask, well, what are the resources, what is the background, what is the foundation through which, what is the history that creates and builds those conditions? We still have those statistics, we still talk about those impacts, but we can interpret and frame and understand them within a context of a structure, right? I think secondly that we need to think about our engagement very differently, that we can engage in these more creative and generative ways, not merely as a decorative element to a planning process, like, oh, we put some art up in the room, that'll spark thoughts, and not in a way that suggests that just having creativity is going to somehow make places more interesting or jazzy, but to think about how some of these more generative approaches, creative approaches, and approaches that allow people to speak from their experience and to drive the conversation may actually shake loose some very different ideas that we would have never thought of as planners. And those can be very concrete things, right? So very specific and within the realm of what we think of as planning ideas about how to implement programs better. But what we found is that through doing this process, we actually come to begin to question in a much more profound way some of the foundations of the work that we're doing, foundational assumptions that we have as planners about sort of the creation and regulation of property, about what is possible as a planning process, that when we start from the past and ground ourselves in the past, we understand and make legible the present in a way that lets us imagine a future that could actually be very transformative.